such a privilege to be invited to present my work with therapeutic stories, story medicine that can sometimes help, soothe, strengthen, build resilience, give hope, sometimes even heal challenging situations and challenging behaviors. I think this approach, working with stories, is a vital part of a new narrative in parenting, in education. Sometimes the stories may be simple, sometimes complex. They can be for all ages. But of course, the focus for this talk is for the young children. Now I want to build a foundation by doing something that we do traditionally in our country. We honor the Indigenous people who have been on the land where we are living and working. And I like, with my story work, to actually try and honor the stories that would have been told across the valleys, the hills, through the forests, on the coastlines, because this is a wonderful imaginative foundation for any kind of story work. And I encourage that no matter what country you are living in, you do the same, that we have this imagination that cultures, especially old cultures, for thousands and thousands of years, have worked with stories at the center, stories integral to humanity, to our humanness. And so when we look back at that, I think it becomes much easier to realize, even if it can be a bit scary for any of you who have never made up stories, it is very much in us, very much. And from my experience, when I've done work in countries around the world, human beings are really thirsting for this as a balance to our more rational, logical approach to teaching and learning. And so this work is very much about an imaginative intelligence, working with imaginative intelligence, what I like to think is really the heart of our humanness. And in having this imagination of cultures around the world that have worked with stories for thousands of years, we can also have this connection to religions around the world. It's very interesting because no matter what religion you study, the wise leaders have really understood that to share a pearl of wisdom in teaching, it is so much more often done with stories and not just giving lectures and giving facts and figures. No matter what religion that you look into, whether it's parables in the Christian religion or little Sufi or Zen tales or stories from the Buddha, many different kinds. And you may now be wondering, and I want to switch now to something more personal for me, because people often ask me, was I born as a story writer? Was it something that came naturally to me? And no. In fact, it's the very opposite picture. I was a mathematics honors maths student at school. I just did mathematics morning, noon, and night. Creative writing was my least favorite subject. And it wasn't until I was in my early 30s, and by then I had 3 little boys, and common sense spoke to me and said, especially at bedtime, put them to bed with stories. And that's when my first real interest came in stories. So I would borrow stories from the library and share stories at bedtime. And then just by accident, it's almost as though something was coming towards me I didn't even know. And a little story I shared with my eldest about a helping elf that did so many jobs in the house. And then I observed this boy over the next couple of weeks wanting to be this helping elf and wanting to do so many jobs around the house. I then began to make up little stories, especially for my youngest son, and he will laugh when he knows that I talk about him. He was an extremely challenging little boy, very dramatic. So at hair washing time, he would scream. He would carry on, and it was such a tense time to even have to keep him clean. A story helped to heal that situation. It's quite a funny, silly little story about a bubble bear that blew bubbles, and bubbles came out its mouth every time it met its friends in the forest. So slowly, and also as a teacher, I began to experiment. I may have had a child hurting other children in my class, and that's how my story, Cranky Crab, was born. The class may have been in quite a whinging, complaining mood. Whinging Whale was born. Perhaps the classroom needed tidying up. A little story like The Little Straw Broom. Any of you who know my first book will know some of these stories. And slowly, slowly, I more and more experimented with this. And all the way along, and something that's very important for any person writing stories, I would listen to the situation. I would make observations of the child, the behavior, what was needed, the age, and so on. And then I would document how the story may have helped or not. I have to thank my grandfather for that, because he was a great documenter, and I think it just flowed into me. And it's a very big part of therapeutic stories. It's not just about having a story, it's about observing and documenting. Did this story help? How did it help? What age group did it help? And so on. I'm just stopping for a drink of water. And so this is how I grew a connection to this work. More than 35, 36 years ago now. And as I more and more wrote, made up therapeutic stories, I started to really see that there was a framework involved. I think if you can see on my whiteboard here. And it's not as though any story is divided into 3 exact parts. It's not like that at all. Everything weaves together to create the final story result. But more and more I realized that there were 3 main parts to story writing. First of all, being very clear about the resolution, trying to clarify what is out of balance in the behavior and what are you trying to bring back towards balance. Is there a child who's being dishonest and therefore you want him to become, or her to become, more honest? Is there a child who's afraid of going to sleep or has nightmares, therefore you want them to feel more secure about bedtime? That's getting the clarity here. And then I would search for metaphors, and this is where so much observation and listening to the situation comes into play. And then, of course, the hard part usually is creating what I like to think is like a dance of the metaphors to create the story journey. Now, I've rushed through that, but I'm going to go into some practical examples for you as part of this talk, because I could stand here and talk lots of theory and it would probably start putting you to sleep at this time of day for you. So I want to share with you, going into the very first year or 2 that I was making up stories for my classes, I had a very interesting experience, and this is one I want to share in depth with you. A little boy, 4 years old, usually a child who would come into the classroom and play very cooperatively and easily, arrived one morning like the wind, and he whirled past me and whirled around the classroom and knocked things off shelves and kicked children, and something obviously had upset him. his mother was just waiting at the door, and I said, Meryl, what has happened? Matthew looks very disturbed this morning. And she said, well, we're all feeling very shaken up because in the middle of the night, last night, a fire started in one corner of our house. And the fire, fortunately, we and the children, we all got outside safely, and we stood in the garden and we watched most of our house burn to the ground before the fire engines could get the fire out. And here is something very interesting, because the mother then explained that she had tried to talk to her 4-year-old son and say, don't worry, Matthew, we have insurance and soon we will get the money. We have to do lots of paperwork. We'll get the money and then we will be able to rebuild the house. Now, that is what I've mentioned before, this sort of rational, logical approach, which sometimes children do need to hear some direct, rational explanations. But it's so easy for us as parents and teachers to overdo that. And obviously, her explanations hadn't helped Matthew at all. And I thought to myself, this boy needs story language, because it is another way of helping a child understand a situation. So while the children were resting that day, I came up with an idea for a story, and I'm going to share it with you quickly. It was a story about bunny rabbits. I knew that they were his favorite animal because he loved to care for the bunny rabbits in our garden, and that seemed a good choice of the main character. And in this story, it was about a family of little baby bunnies. They all lived together with their mother in a deep hole in the ground. And every day they would come up out of their hole and they would play and run and jump and have fun in the long grass all around. And then they would go back in their bunny hole and sleep. Now, one day, the mother had to leave the babies sleeping deep down in their bunny hole, and she had to go further, cross some fields to do some work, look for some food. When she came back, a bushfire had come up and had swept across that field and burnt that grass all the way to the ground. And the mother bunny stopped at the edge of the field thinking, oh, will my babies be okay? And she had to wait for the ground to cool down a little bit, and then she hopped across the field and peered down into the bunny hole. The babies were still fast asleep, safe and sound. And the mother hopped into the bunny hole, and she also fell fast asleep. And when the bunnies woke up, they peered up over the edge. Already, very slowly, little green shoots were beginning to grow out of the blackened ground. And they watched and they waited and they waited and they watched. And day after day after day, the little green shoots grew taller and taller and taller and taller until the lovely long grass was just as it was, and the baby rabbits could play in that playground once again. You can see it's a story that tried to mirror the situation and also give a very soothing, safe message at the end. Well, before the children were about to be picked up by their parents, I gathered them not just for a goodbye song, but to share this story. And when I finished, Matthew was the first one to say, oh, Susan, can we hear that story tomorrow? And the next day, and the next day? And already inside, I was smiling, thinking, this has spoken deeply to him. And then when his mother arrived, he ran out and greeted her. He was a very small boy, and he reached up and he tried to tap her up here on the shoulder, trying to pat her. Mummy, everything's going to be all right. And those were the words that he said to the mother. the story had really spoken deeply to him. And this, I think, it's a very good example of using story language in the right moment. Yes. At this point, I'd like to introduce you to this woman. I'm holding up a book by her. Chik Ying, at the moment, you're the one in the main screen. Can you put me in the screen? Hang on.
Are you on the
The
main?
moment, am I the main one in your screen? Can everyone see this book?
Jagdish, okay.
Yes, no, because at the moment you're still the one in the main screen. So I don't know if that's the same for everyone, but that needs to be sorted, because when I do some work here, people need to see the whiteboard clearly.
Okay, can
but anyway,
Susan, can I double check with Jagdish? If Susan is on the main screen, can you thumbs up?
Yes, she is. Yes, she is.
Yeah.
Oh, good. Thank you.
Thank you, dear.
Okay, because I'm not on mine, and that's a bit strange. Okay. Okay, Kate, thank you for that. That's what I thought, but I can't change it myself, which is a bit strange. So this woman, Dr. Margot Sunderland, she is Director of Education and Training for Child Mental Health in London. She's in a very important position, and she talks of how important it is that children grow up with a wealth of picture and story language, and that parents and teachers don't just continually give children rational, logical explanations and what she calls dead little words. And of course, there's sometimes when you do need to have a logical approach, or a truck might be coming down the road and you want to quickly hold the child's hand so they're not going to be in danger. You're not going to take time to story an approach to speak to the child. But there are many, many situations when we can work more out of story in our language with children. And she believes, and writes in that book I showed you, that story language is actually the natural language for children, much more natural than our adult conceptual logical approach. So I think that that's something very important for everyone to digest, because it also really confirms the importance of this therapeutic story work. Now, a few years after I had taught, I then got a job in our local council working for the government, and my role was to give advice and help parents and teachers with children with challenging behavior. And through that work, more and more, I was developing therapeutic stories. And then slowly I started to develop some trainings to help others write therapeutic stories, because there are so many unique situations in the world, so many unique situations in families and communities that really require or kind of call out for a story to be written for them. Of course, there's a wealth of folk and fairy tales that we can dip into, and I'm not discouraging your use of those at all. But there are some times, and now I'm going to give you a quick example for a teenager here, because it's a wonderful example of what a unique situation this story addressed. This happened 6 years ago in Croatia. The mother came to a seminar and said she needed to write a story for her 17-year-old daughter. The daughter had had a serious illness and she now could no longer walk. And she had inherited the same disease from her grandmother. And the daughter was, as you could understand, very depressed, very angry that this had happened in her life at such a young age. And she refused to come out from her bed. Her parents had bought her a wheelchair because that was then the only way she could be mobile, and she was refusing to use it. Now, at the seminar, the mother wrote a story. It was actually very short. There's no even any rules for this. You can't even think that a story for a teenager may need to be much, much longer than a story for a young child. This one was very, very short, but very symbolic. And it was a story about a black stone necklace. And in the story, it talks of a young girl who inherited a beautiful stone necklace from her grandmother. She wore it with pride. As her life went on and the years went by, she would wear it ice skating, climbing mountains. Everywhere she went, the black stone necklace went too. But after many years, the weight of this necklace became heavier and heavier. And she found that when she tried to ice skate, she would fall to the ground. When she tried to walk upstairs, the weight of the necklace would pull her down. And eventually, on one particular day, the necklace grew so heavy, it pulled her down and she fell to the ground, and the black stone in the heart of the necklace cracked open. Inside was a beautiful amethyst, and the amethyst seemed to whisper, "I can show you a way forward. I can shine a light forward." That was the story. Of course, there was no mention about wheelchairs or anything like that. That is that's why it's such a good example of metaphor in story. Now, the mother typed this story out, and she also had a little amethyst ring. She knew an amethyst was her daughter's favorite gemstone. And one evening before bed, she gave the girl the story and the ring. And the next morning, the girl called out to her from her bedroom, "Please come." And she told her parents that with the help of the story and the ring, she could now use a wheelchair. It was a remarkable step forward. And 6 years later, I was visiting Croatia, and I was visited by this girl. She arrived at the venue where I was working. She had a big bunch of flowers on her lap, a box of chocolates for me. I had to go down the stairs to greet her, and it was a bit embarrassing for the venue because they didn't have wheelchair ramp for her to come up. And she very proudly told me that she's now at university in Croatia, and she's an advocate for disability services. And she has advocated to get ramps into the rooms and an elevator in the main lecture hall. And she was a very empowered 23-year-old young woman. And that was all through the help of a story. And that's a remarkable example. Not all stories can do that kind of very powerful work, but some stories may just help a tiny bit. And even that, because it's such a natural medicine, well, that is a wonderful that is something worth trying. So those are two examples. And the other main example I want to work with you in this talk, because I want to take you into a process of how it was written, was a story written for a little girl in Bulgaria. Because as I then became published, my books were in quite a few languages, and so I'm very fortunate. I was invited to many countries to run seminars. And in this particular time, I was in a country called Bulgaria, in the capital city, Sofia, running a seminar for a group of psychologists. And the group had agreed to work on a story for a very urgent situation. And the situation was to do with a little girl only 5 years old, who a month before had lost her father. He had died in his sleep. He had a brain tumor and it came on very sudden. And this little girl was left not only grieving the loss of her father, but she was also left with an incredible fear of going to sleep and a fear of her mother going to sleep. And she had developed a behavior each night where she would run around, she would scratch herself, she would bite herself, she would do anything to keep herself awake. And eventually, tiredness would pull her down and sometimes she would just fall asleep on the floor. Then she would wake up, and if her mother had already fallen asleep, she would run in and shake her mother. Wake up, wake up. We can't sleep, we can't sleep. Now this sleep-deprived mother and the also grieving and sleep-deprived came to see a psychologist. What could she do to help this girl overcome her fear of going to sleep? How could the little girl become confident to fall asleep? And the psychologist had suggested different strategies. There was a star chart on the wall and the girl got stars on the chart depending on how many hours that she had slept. I think at one point the mother even gave little balls of chocolate in the morning depending on how many hours the girl had slept. She tried to reason with the little girl. They were a Christian family and she said, "Your father is up in heaven. He is looking down, watching you. He can see that at school you're very tired and your father wants you to fall asleep at nighttime." All of these approaches weren't making any difference. And then the psychologist came to a story writing seminar. She'd never worked with stories before. And the other psychologists in the group all agreed that together they wanted to try and write a story for this little girl. And they did write a story, and I'm going to share it with you because the story did remarkable healing, remarkable work. I just need a drink of water before I share this. So I'm going to tell you the story and then I'm going to tell you what happened afterwards. There was once a little coloured house that sat at the edge of a town. And in this little coloured house, there was a strong, sturdy table. And on top of the table sat a beautiful music box. Every morning, the lid of the music box would open, and inside there was a ballerina, and the ballerina would dance around and around and around. All day long she would dance. And then every evening, the music box lid would close and the ballerina could rest. And life went on. For many years in this little coloured house, the ballerina would dance round and round in the day, and at night the ballerina would rest. But then one evening, a terrible storm came across that town and shook and blew and shook that little coloured house so strongly, one of the legs of the table broke right off. The music box balanced somehow on top, but the lid opened so wide it couldn't find a way to close again. And the ballerina was left dancing round and around and around, all through that night, all the next day, round and round, all the next night, round and round, many days, many nights. But one evening, passing by the window of the little coloured house came the spirit of the dreams. The spirit of the dreams looked in and came inside and sang a special song. And that special song helped the lid of the music box to close. And the ballerina was able to rest. The next morning, the spirit of the dreams came back in through the window, sang a different kind of song, and the lid of the music box could open, and the ballerina could dance again. And from that day on, the spirit of the dreams always remembered to visit the little coloured house, and the ballerina was able to dance and rest and dance and rest as before. So that was the story. And the first thing that the psychologist did was, after the seminar, she called the mother into her office and she shared the story because she wanted to check that the mother was okay, that the little girl would hear it. And the mother fell in love with the story, and also said that she had a friend who was an artist and she wanted to call the friend in to paint the spirit of the dreams on her little girl's bedroom wall. The spirit of the dreams is a character out of Bulgarian folklore, which is, I think, is why it resonated so deeply with this mother and the girl. And so the next day, while the little girl was at school, the artist came and painted a beautiful dream spirit on the bedroom wall. And when the girl came home from school, she went in and put her bag down in the bedroom and she saw the beautiful painting. "Mother, what is this?" And the mother said, "When we have had our evening meal, I have a story to tell you. Then you will understand the painting on the wall." And so they had a meal together, and then the mother shared the story. And when the little girl had heard the story, she climbed into bed, she pulled the covers up, and she fell into a very long and very deep sleep. And for many, many nights afterwards, every evening, the mother would read the story and the little girl would have a long and deep sleep, as children need to do. So that was the story. And we still have a little bit of time because we started 5 minutes late and we had a bit of a mix up. So I'm going to take you through the process. And please keep in mind that there is so much to cover with therapeutic story work that all I can do is share a few of these examples and a few little bits of technique and theory. But of course, I have my books. I'm not here to advertise my books, and I do run trainings. But sometimes it's just enough for you to hear some examples, and I think you might be surprised how much the story maker inside you starts to speak. So I'm going to rub this off. I'll just leave the M and the J. I'll just leave the M. Can you see me? Yes? I'll leave the M, the J, and the R up there as a reminder. But in the middle, just put this down. I'm going to do something we do in our trainings, a mind map, which is a very good way to collect ideas for metaphors. And this is what the group that wrote that story, this is the process they did. They put in the middle, first of all, the age of the child, 5 years old, and then they put, fear of sleep, which was the challenge, fear of sleep. And then they listed different things that the psychologist knew about the little girl, the kinds of things she liked. Dancing, music, ballet, ballerinas. I'm hoping you can hear me while I'm talking to this. Yeah, chick, yeah, good, good. They also she liked cats, she liked ponies, but you will have heard that they decided when they were writing the story that it was too busy to include all of those things. But in the beginning, they listed them. They also listed a few things to do with the situation, day and night. And night, which is obviously connected to sleep. Then they were looking for what we call an obstacle, and kind of an obstacle metaphor, and that's why they brought in the storm. And then they were looking for a helping metaphor, and that's why they brought in something out of their, you don't always have to search for something in your folklore. Helping metaphors can come from many sources, but the dream spirit. But the interesting thing with this process was that they got a little bit of a way into a story and then they got stuck. So then I suggested to them what I share with anyone in my trainings: when you get really stuck, go walking. I sent them out into the garden and they walked round and round in circles, and then just the walking got their creative thinking going. And by the time they came back in, one of them had thought of one more metaphor for the story. The music box. And once they had the idea of the music box, that reflected perfectly the sleep and the waking, the music box lid, the sleep and the waking, the sleep and the waking. They then went through an even different process and they crossed out what was in the middle. And in the middle, they put balance between sleeping and waking. And they really then had their resolution for the story. So I hope you don't find that too confusing, but I'm just taking you through a journey of 6 people writing a story and what was involved, but what wonderful work they ended up doing. Of course, there was nothing there that was going to help. You can't heal grief, of course not. But to help with the sleep deprivation was such a wonderful thing. So there, so in the middle, yes, they had balance between sleeping and waking. There's many, many ways you can play with a mind map. And if any of you do have my books and you want to explore this further, there's a lot of theory in my first and second books on this. Because when my publisher first agreed to publish my first book, he said to me, you can't give them the fish without the fishing rod. He talked in metaphor. He said, you really need to give lots of tips and techniques. How do you find ways to write stories? Help to share those. And so I have to thank him for that, for pushing me to try to put down so much on paper. There are many, many stories we can write for individuals. There are many stories that we may feel a need to write for whole groups, for whole communities, for challenging situations. Just last year, and also where what you're in at the moment with the lockdown, what a huge challenge to humankind. And last March, when I, again, through listening and observing, I was hearing children talking, oh no, we have to stay home, this is terrible. And I was also hearing parents telling children about the scary germs and the poison and all kinds of terrible ways to word things. And I thought, these children need a story. They need a story that helps them feel, all right, there is something unusual happening, but it's okay to be at home and we can do many great things at home. So any of you who know, I put for free on my website the little gnome who had to stay home. And I think it just spoke to so many people around the world, because in 2 weeks it was in 26 languages, because we thirst for story language. And it really did speak to that. So there are many, our environment's in need of helping and healing. We can be trying to write stories for the environment, stories that can start discussion with families and in school classrooms and so on. So many situations can be helped with stories. So I could go on sharing examples, or I can stop and we can have, well, we did promise to have some questions. So let me just check in, please, with Chik Ying. Have anyone put some questions in the chat box?
Yeah, I think Jane got a question to raise. Jane, you prefer to speak out, is that so? You can unmute yourself if you would like to.
Hi Susan, hi Chi Ying. Can hear
Hello.
me? Hi. Hold on. Okay. All right. Hi everyone. Can hear me clearly? Okay.
Yes, we can. Yes.
Susan, I have a question. I have 3 children. They are 5, 7, and 9. We have bedtime story most of the nights, but according to some examples that you quoted just now, for example, like the eldest, he's 9. Sometimes maybe I found out that he may have um, some characters or habits that maybe we need to we need to educate him.
Sure,
But
sure. Need to speak to him. Yes.
yes, but is it suitable to tell the same story to the 7 and 5 years old all together?
I think you have to use your common sense with this. And sometimes it may be very important that you just share that directly with the eldest boy or eldest child. It would be the same for a teacher in a class. If it's a very sensitive issue, and also if you think that the rest of the class will identify that you have made that story for one particular child, and then they start to make fun of that child, that is not healthy. It's best that you didn't either give the story to the parents to read at home, or you do, or perhaps if the school has a school counselor, you just have the school counselor share the story one-on-one with that boy. So yeah, you have to use your common sense there, but there's nothing wrong with separating and having perhaps an extra story for the elder one. And that's when you might share something specifically for him. But again, yes, sometimes the little ones can just hear and enjoy your voice and they don't even really take in the deeper message. So it's also sometimes to do the separation, you know, or you may not even have enough energy to have so many stories at nighttime. So again, you've got to find a balance for you too. I wouldn't want there to be so much stress around story time that actually makes things much worse. It's all a matter of balance, isn't it? Okay, good. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane.
All right. Anyone else?
Yes. Hi, Susan. My name is Erica.
Hello, Erica.
Thank you so much for all the work you do and for sharing this session today. Already the tool you've shared I find fantastic, quite simple. My question is the process different if you want to shape a story for adults? That's the first question. And the second question is, what is the role, or is there a formula for the rhythm and the tone of telling the story? So those are the two questions I have. Thank you.
Okay, let me start with the second question. There is a lot to do with helping people be storytellers. I try not to focus on that because I feel it's too much to take on. I used to just teach courses on storytelling, but I think to try and take on a training where you're learning how to write a therapeutic story, then also having the kind of pressure and stress of, are you telling it? Okay, I separate them out. I think the more you practice your storytelling, the more you build up that kind of rhythm and tone. I think you'll also, the more stories of all kinds that you read, you start to get rhythms and rhymes and repetitions, especially for young children. And so you start to incorporate those in your writing, and that is good too. I think not to go too fast, but also not to be telling it so slowly that everyone falls asleep. Now, stories for adults. Yes, my work started writing stories for children. But when I started to run trainings, almost every training, someone would come along and say, I did come here to write a story for a child, but the more I'm sitting processing this, the more I'm thinking I need something for myself or my elderly parent or a teenager. And yes, it's possible to write therapeutic stories for any age, including ourselves. And when I run trainings, I always have some time where I encourage people to actually work on something for yourself. Which is sometimes hard to do. And I have a random story card game where people have to pick out random words to make up a story, because it can become so subjective that you don't know where to start. And that can help to break through.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Erica. There are two questions from the chat box. One from Resta. Which one should be our consideration most? Suitable stories for certain age or the related stories with the condition?
Well, I would say that they should be combined, because if you're writing a story for a challenging behavior, you also really need to take into account the age you're writing for. So if you, let's just think of let's say that you've got a child who's having nightmares and is really very anxious at bedtime. The child might be 3 or the child might be 12. You would have very different stories for the 3-year-old or the 12-year-old. So you do need to take into account the age you're writing for.
Okay.
So the answer to that is both.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, Susan. Another question from Theo.
Yeah, I see that about the fairy tales.
Yeah. Usually fairy tale we used to tell for 3 weeks. How about healing story? How long can we tell for age 4 to 6 years old?
Okay. Okay, well, I don't ever like to give any rules, because I don't think stories sit so comfortably with rules. Certainly when I was a teacher, I would, in terms of my stories for story time, then yes, I would do those for 2 to 3 weeks, and maybe I might do them as a puppet show. I'm talking kindergarten work here. Any grade teachers would have different approaches here. But sometimes when a need for a healing story arises, like that boy with the fire in the house, I listen to that as well. I listen to that need. And normally I wouldn't have done a story at goodbye time, but it just was important to do that. And I did that for probably 3 or 4 days. And then sometimes the child that you have in mind, they might just say, I don't want to hear, or I don't need to hear that anymore, Susan. You need to listen to that too. Something else is that you may want to just give a typed copy of the story to the parent so they can just share it with the child. And then the parent has to use some common sense or have correspondence with you as the teacher. How long do I use it for? But I don't think we can have exact rules with this. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. There are 2 more questions here from Sherway. I love the crazy crab story in your first book, and it was perfect for my boy who was having issue attacking his friends. But after telling the story for a month at bedtime, there seems to be no change. What could be the issue? And what do you do when your story doesn't help with your intended resolution?
Okay, well, you could say you go back to the drawing board, you go back to the writing board. But also we can't ever claim that a therapeutic story is always going to do, 100% work. It's a bit like natural medicine. It's a matter of finding the right fit. And sometimes stories might work for a while and then something different is needed. And also stories aren't the only strategy. They should be part of a whole collection of different strategies to help with challenging behavior. You could make up stories and tell stories day and night for weeks, months, but if you don't have healthy rhythms and routines in home life and school life, a child could be very anxious and insecure because there's none of those basics. So there's many things, many strategies, and stories is just one of those strategies. So I'm just seeing our timing, and also if anyone else has asked a question, it's probably a bit unfair to let one person have 2 questions. But if there's no more questions, we could look at the second one.
Yeah, there's one from Michelle. I have a non-verbal autistic child, but he enjoys stories most of the time with props. With limited understanding of vocabulary, I find using metaphor difficult. But I know I shall try. Do you have any tips?
Yeah. This isn't the first time that I've heard of this situation. From how I understand it, autistic children do need more matter-of-fact stories, but you can still have a story journey. But I think the fact that she's using props, she's already giving pictures, and pictures and metaphors are very connected. And also, if you have a story journey that has a metaphor or a main character different to who you're writing it about, you're actually helping to get a message through in a very unconscious, safe way, you could say, because you're not putting the child in the limelight, you're not showing any guilt or shame or anything. You're just simply showing a journey of a character who perhaps used to hurt all his friends, and now he's using an elephant, hurt all his friends, and now he's using his elephant trunk to do constructive things.
Yeah. Thank you. I think that in a way related to one of the private message question, how can I find metaphoric inspiration that is related to the challenging behavior?
Okay. Look, that's a very good question. And there are many, many metaphors. That's where a very good idea is to play with a mind map. Put the challenging behavior in the middle. For example, perhaps you have a child who is spitting at other children. Now, of course, in many cultures, spitting's okay, but I don't think in any culture spitting and the face of other children is good. Yes? So that's not that's not an appropriate behavior. So if you were to put spitting in the middle, and then you list all the things around the mind map that you think of, what can spit? A camel, a hose, you know, a hose in the garden can spit water. Collect lots of ideas around that gesture or that behavior. And that's just a very good starting point. I find mind maps, even if I'm giving a keynote talk, I will plan it using a mind map, because I like the way that it's not putting things in a list order, it's letting you play. And the playful nature of our imagination it's very important with constructing stories. Our imagination needs time to play. We don't want to be thinking so seriously and so stressful. Oh, I've got to write a story. I've got to write a story. Once upon a time there was, oh, what am I going to think of? You know, you put ideas around a mind map and you'll be surprised how they almost dance off the page towards you sometimes. So there we are. And shall we finish here? Are there any more?
Yeah, it's 5:05 now. If there's any last question, you can raise now. Or Susan, you can give a final words or reflection to close the session for today. Any more questions from the floor?
I just encourage you. I'll say some final words. Okay? Yes? Is that right, Chiking?
Yeah.
Yes?
Yeah.
I encourage you to find ways to exercise your own imagination. A lot of us have had educations that have squashed it and just helped develop what they call the left side of the brain, the more rational, logical side. So find ways, whether it's doing different art, dancing, movement, walking, reading many other stories. You can get so many ideas reading other stories, folk tales, fairy tales, collections of therapeutic stories. Feed your imagination and then play and give it a go. We have a saying in Australia, Kate, there in the audience will laugh at this. We have a saying, give it an Aussie go. And the more that you give something a go and you try it out, and I don't mean irresponsibly try it out with children, but carefully try it out, really all you need is one little experience where you know that story has spoken to who you've written it for. And it is so encouraging and so exciting. It just pushes you forward to want to do more story work. And sometimes it's really hard work. It's not, but sometimes it just comes to you in an intuitive way. Stay open to that as well. I think that is what my final word, really. My best stories have been intuitive flashes, and they don't come very often. So it's a real gift when it happens. Stay open to that. And thank you to Chik Ying. She was so determined to have this happen for Malaysia. And she's done, you would be surprised how much preparation goes into just planning a simple hour like this. So thank you very much. And I wish you all well with your story making and storytelling.
Thank you, Susan, for the beautiful sharing. And thank you all for attending. We can now unmute ourselves and then we'll say bye-bye to all.
Okay.
Thank you again.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.